Hey, what's up, A-Push kids? We're back for our next lecture in AP US History. Today, our topic is 8.6, Early Steps in the Civil Rights Movement. Our learning objective today is 8G, explain how and why the Civil Rights Movement developed and expanded from 1945 to 1960. Our first key idea says, the three branches of the federal government used measures including desegregation of the armed services and Brown v. Board of Education to promote greater racial equality. Now, by 1950, the United States was still a segregated society, but we were segregated in two different ways. In the South, for the most part, we faced what were called Jim Crow laws, and this created a segregated society through what was called de jure segregation, or legalized segregation, segregation by law. Now, this was a little bit different than what most African Americans faced in the North. In the North, white flight to the suburbs had essentially created two different societies, a white suburbia and an African American inner city. And so segregation happened more by custom or circumstance rather than by laws, though certainly local ordinances did not help this situation. And this was known as de facto segregation. But we start to see that change during the Truman and Eisenhower administrations. After World War II, African Americans are going to start to gain some successes in civil rights. And in 1948, Truman becomes the first president to attack segregation. He's going to issue an executive order to integrate the military, and in that same order, it outlaws the discrimination of African Americans in the hiring of government employees. A few years later, the modern civil rights movement is going to begin in 1954 with the Supreme Court decision in Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. Now, in this case, the NAACP is going to take the lead in civil rights, and segregated schools become their primary target. Now, this was because segregated school districts spend 10 times more on white students than they did on black students. And the NAACP's strategy was to use this information in their lawsuits to challenge that segregation violated the 14th Amendment. Now, in the Brown v. Board of Education court case, the Topeka School District had denied Linda Brown from attending a white school 4 blocks from her house. The NAACP lawyer Thurgood Marshall used the 14th Amendment to attack public school segregation. He argued that even quote-unquote equal schools in every way, if they were separate, implied that black children were inferior to white children. Now, in a unanimous decision, and the Supreme Court in 1954 is going to rule that separate facilities were inherently unequal. And the Chief Justice at this time, Earl Warren, who we'll talk more in detail about in a future lecture, is going to state that segregation violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Now, this had a major impact on southern states. And because of this, what we start to see is that this is going to overturn Plessy v. Ferguson and have a major impact on schools throughout the country. For instance, you see the regions of the country in brown are all the regions where schools were required to be segregated. In the North, they could be segregated, or the West, they could be segregated. In the North, segregation was prohibited. Now, with school segregation banned, and this was a significant step in overturning segregation in other regions. Because if segregation in Sector A, let's say, in this case education was illegal, then segregation in some other areas then, it was hard to then argue that that segregation was legal. So this is going to have a huge ripple effect throughout the United States. Now, interesting enough, there's Linda Brown on the steps holding up the newspaper saying that she had won. Now, the Brown decision, though, was divisive throughout the country. Schools integrated immediately in places like Baltimore, St. Louis, Washington, D.C. But Southern leaders vowed to resist integration, and the KKK returned to power in many areas to block integration. Now, at first, Eisenhower had left enforcement of the Brown decision up to the states and didn't enforce the decision directly. Now, in Georgia, We see resistance to Brown through our wonderful, that's air quotes, Governor Herman Talmadge. For instance, he said the people of Georgia will not comply with the decision of the court. We're going to do whatever is necessary in Georgia to keep white children in white schools and colored children in colored schools. He even goes on to say non-segregation in our schools will never work as long as red blood runs in white men's veins. Our history is just quote-unquote wonderful, isn't it? Anyways, we're going to have a breakthrough. It's going to get better, guys. 1957. Eisenhower is forced to support integration. Now, this happens when, in Arkansas, the Little Rock Central School District had plans to start to integrate their school. And their plan was at their Central High School. Now, what they wanted to do was they wanted to integrate the school slowly. That they were concerned, and I think that these are somewhat legitimate concerns, that they were worried about violence within the school and doing it slowly. So what they did was they selected 9 students from the all-black high school to slowly integrate Central High School. And they were going to do it over a period of years, bringing students more and more in until they could fully integrate the school. So it would also allow them to make sure that not only did the students get used to one another, but they also had the facilities to handle the new size of the population. Now, the school district had their plan, but this Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus is going to step in. And he calls in the Arkansas National Guard to keep the black students from enrolling at Central High School. In fact, he sends them and has them form a perimeter around the school to literally prevent these 9 students from enrolling in the school. You can see them in the background right here, as one of the freshman black girls is nearly lynched outside of the school. Now, at this point, I do want to make an important point, all right, that you need to really have an understanding of. That the image that you see on the bottom left is not a still photograph. It's part of a video. And there's a close tie with what happens domestically with the civil rights movement and what's happening internationally at the same time with the Cold War. All right. So the Cold War, as we've talked about in 2 previous videos, is all about these competing ideologies. You know, you've got the American ideology, which we're talking about freedom and democracy and individual rights and liberties and all this stuff. But what's happening at Central High School in Little Rock, in the heart of the country, is anything but that. If our message to the world is we are freedom, then these images coming out of Central High School are anything but. The Soviets take this film and they start spreading it around the world. They're like, hey, look, America is being they're hypocrites. They're talking about freedom and democracy, and they don't even have it in their own country, in the heart of their country. They're not even giving it to their kids. This is embarrassing for Eisenhower. Eisenhower is in the middle of trying to win the Cold War. I mean, we're in the middle of the arms race, 1957. This is, Sputnik. It just got launched. I mean, this is kind of an intense time in the United States. So Eisenhower calls up Orville Faubus and tells him he needs to let the kids go to school. And Orville Faubus makes the mistake of telling Eisenhower no. Now, Eisenhower, 5-star general, he was the commander of hundreds of thousands, millions of soldiers during World War II. He's not a man you say no to. And so Eisenhower sends in the army to force the integration of the black students in the Little Rock 9. And not only does he send in the army, but he sends in one of the most decorated military units in the entire U.S. arsenal. That's the 101st Airborne Division. He sends to Little Rock to walk the kids not only to school, but to class. Leading us to key idea number 2. Seeking to fulfill the Reconstruction era promises, civil rights activists and political leaders achieved some legal and political successes in ending segregation, although progress towards racial equality was slow. So we're going to dial back the clock just 2 years and go back to 1955. A little lady you've probably heard of before, Rosa Parks. Now, Rosa Parks was arrested for disobeying an Alabama law requiring segregation on city buses. Now, what this is going to spark is the Montgomery Bus Boycotts. Now, there is a little bit of speculation about how much of a kind of setup it was and what Rosa Parks had done before and how much of a little seamstress she really was. She was in her 20s at the time. But either way, the Montgomery bus boycotts are going to be huge. And so they call in from Atlanta a young preacher named Minister Martin Luther King Jr. And what he's going to do is he's going to organize a 381-day boycott of the bus system to protest segregation. And the boycott is going to be incredibly effective. Not only do African Americans do they just start walking to work, but many of them organize carpools. Churches get really involved in helping to drive people to work, making sure that people don't miss time at work because of the bus system. And the thing is what Martin Luther King Jr. realized very early on was that the bus system in Montgomery depended on African American ridership. The majority of riders on the Montgomery bus system were black. And since they were boycotting, and it was an effective boycott, all of a sudden the bus system started to hemorrhage money. They were losing money incredibly. And what this did is this then brought them to the negotiating table. And what King realizes early on is that he can leverage the power, the economic power of the African American community in nonviolent protests to achieve change. And what this boycott leads to is it leads to the integration of city buses. It also leads to the rise of Martin Luther King Jr. as a leader not only of the black community, but also of black civil rights. Because of the success of the Montgomery bus boycott, Martin Luther King Jr. is going to form the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or the SCLC, in 1957. It was formed to use not only activism, but also nonviolent protest to bring an end to segregation. He was, as you can see from the picture hanging on the wall next to his desk, inspired by people like Mahatma Gandhi from India and their nonviolent protests. Now, the SCLC soon will overtake the NAACP as the leading civil rights group in America. Now, the SCLC was based mostly on the resistance, not only peaceful resistance, but also, according to Martin Luther King Jr., Christian love. I'll let you read the quote yourself. Now, Martin Luther King Jr.'s nonviolent approach will also inspire other groups to act. For instance, in 1960, students from North Carolina A&T are going to lead a sit-in at a segregated lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina. Now, if you're like, what's a lunch counter? It's Waffle House. Like, they're all Waffle Houses now. That's basically what they are. And this sit-in movement will inspire other sit-ins across the South at the time. Here's a few other examples of those different sit-ins, and then the violence that's attended with those. Now, this sit-in movement is going to lead to the creation of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Now, they were an organization that included both whites and blacks. Notice the button on the right-hand side, and it has a white and a black hand shaking. In the sit-in movements, they included whites and blacks. Notice you had, in this picture, you've got one African-American female, two whites that are involved in the sit-ins as well. They even practiced their nonviolent training as well. They'll become more pivotal as we get into the 1960s and our next lecture. So in review, what we've kind of talked about is we've talked about how not only did individual groups, but the government become involved in the early civil rights movement with actions like Truman integrating the armed forces and the Supreme Court overturning Brown v. Board of Education. But also groups will form at this time which mostly deal with nonviolent protests, such as Martin Luther King Jr., who comes to prominence in 1955 and 56 with the Montgomery bus boycotts, his creation of the SCLC, and the student movement and sit-in movements, which would eventually create the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee of SNCC. Don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button. And until next time, and as always, go Pack.